Hi, my name is James Leone. I'm going to hope to talk in the near future about different usability features or issues, sorry, that come up with using various kinds of software that's available for public use, and with the hope of coming up with constructive criticisms and to point some things out and hopefully to make some suggestions for long-term, hopefully, usability improvements for people. Now, I do know that usability is a buzzword that sometimes a lot of people think, oh god, more changes, just leave us alone, we're happy as we are. And just to show you that I understand this whole thing and how it works, I'm using KDE3. So there you go. Um, so now, and I'm not going to call this a bias. I'm actually, I guess I could do a whole video discussing what usability functions are missing from GNOME that has gravitated me towards this, or I could just leave it at that and say this is the most usable environment. And hopefully I'll be able to point those things out. And I'm not here to crown a champion and walk away. What I really want to do is bring up issues where the criticisms can be eliminated from whatever it is I'm using. That, for example, say GNOME. Here's one thing you can't really do in GNOME, I'm pretty sure. If you right click on a folder, go to permissions, and it'll say, if you know, you can go and you can change permission, right? It'll say if you have other permissions underneath there, it'll say you can apply it to all the different folders. In fact, it's a bad example, so let me go to something else. Here. See that box just apply changes to all the subfolders and the content? It's very important for a graphical user interface user to have that checkbox and have it actually work. And now the last time I checked, this may not still be the case, but last time I checked GNOME, that didn't work. And that ends up being one small usability issue out of a whole bunch of things that when you add them up together, it ends up driving people away. So doesn't really matter if the start menu is at the top rather at the bottom. That really, to me, really isn't a usability issue. Or the colors are more gnomish than KDE, or the folders look like they're GNOME folders versus that. Those aren't really usability issues. But usability issues really are, to my mind, the things that I will address or try to address to try and attempt to be helpful. Are things that you can't do because of the way the thing's designed, or you can't do very easily. And I'm also going to point out what I believe are some basic principles towards usability. And I'll have some criticisms of some things I think are just kind of not really important, but people seem to feel they're important at this stage of the game. To step back, I was a little rough on the NetBSD project. Okay, I made a video about it, but I was trying to just do an install and get it to the point where it got to KDE3. And one thing I did notice later is that during the install, I wasn't able to get their new package manager installed, and so therefore I wouldn't be able to install KDE3, at least using the package in command. Now, the fact that it failed is some sort of usability issue to some point. And also, in addition to that, the fact that the user starts out with the black box and has to work his way out of that is a usability issue, and it doesn't have to be that way. It doesn't have to be that kind kind of choice. So, when I look at, I've seen some discussions, and I'm just paraphrasing basically, on some of the NetBSD mailing lists, and I know this is true. There's some people that do much better in a traditional Unix environment. Hands down, they can fly in that. They could outdo me in any day, and there are some usability cases, in which it's a lot quicker to do certain things by command line than you ever would be able to do with graphical user interface. And hopefully I'll demonstrate an example of that at some point. I won't forget. But the one thing the NetBSD project doesn't do with their installer is they don't ask you as the very first question, just one more question, would you like to proceed with the traditional installer, or would you like to proceed with the graphical installer? I think that's really what they should do, and that would probably be the best way for them to approach this whole thing. Because I think they're really locking out a lot of potential users from their user base. That could benefit from a very good operating system that they've created that's ported to a number of pieces of hardware. And I know, because I've used NetBSD, and I've had a very similar setup to this. I've had KDE3 on it. I've done the package source thing. I've compiled the whole thing before, and I've installed it from binaries that were up on the net. I'm going to hope I can get a reasonably good video made that just show you to come up with a way to get this done fairly easily. And what I have in mind is to download these, hopefully find the pre-compiled packages and download them, and then proceed that way. But okay, if I talk in and then I got to balance this between specifics and generalities. So if I talk in terms of too many generalities, and I don't go into actually specific use cases, it's not going to be very useful. But if I get into too many specifics, it's going to feel like I'm nitpicking or picking on somebody, which is not really the intention. The really is to say, hey, why don't you change this? So, GNOME people, if you haven't changed the ability to copy the properties down a directory tree by checking a box and making sure that that actually works, do that. That'll be one step forward. Now, I do have some general criticisms, and it started with, and not just aimed towards GNOME, but the general trend that a search box is supposed to solve all your problems. Google's good, but there is some, in general, a lot of people are used to going on to the webpage or Yahoo, Google, whatever, and searching for a term and then getting an answer and looking through the various results that come up and selecting one. And so one would think that you might be able to apply this kind of thing to a desktop and then end up not having all this horrific clutter, you know. And I got a lot of icons, but to me, it doesn't bother me at all because, well, if I want to use something, I just click on it. There it is. It's right there. Don't need to find it. No need to search for it. There it is. I have a lot of desk space. So some things should be, you know what I mean? And then if I want to do something else, just click on it. I don't have to wait for a search result. It's there. And I think we've lost that with this whole idea of using search boxes to find things. In general, the balance between to my mind, the balance between a desktop and icons and having some decorations to it and some clutter is really the best result that you can have. You have the important stuff that you use a lot, just a point and a click away. That's easier than searching. I don't see how anybody could argue otherwise. And because Linux has a lot of unique application names, well, someone might be looking for, they'll put Word in the search box. It doesn't mean that Open LibreOffice Writer is going to open. Or LibreOffice Writer is going to open. And that, the whole idea of having a search box as a primary thing, to me, doesn't make any sense. Another usability issue. I don't think Linux should ever move away. It already has, but it should go back to, doesn't matter if you're GNOME, if you're KDE, whatever. Also, the mouse should behave the way people are used to mouses behaving. So, a long time ago, I've tried other, X window environments, and what really bugged me about them was this idea that you had to right-click and drag down and kind of maze your way down to your category to use. And still, here in KDE, you still have that option. You can do some things, not everything, but pretty much it's when you click on something, the result is that you get options that relate to the thing you're clicking on, which includes your desktop. Okay. The one thing I don't like about KDE, I never have, is that even though they have done their best, and I can't really say it's KDE's issue necessarily. It's more like, I think it's the package managers, or even the people that create the. Basically, this whole thing gets really kind of odd. So, I've seen in some cases where the KDE Control Center ends up configuring more than just KDE. Now, of course, or that could be the same thing with GNOME. But at the same time, if you separate that out and you have like system configuration stuff and on a different line, it's also confusing to the user because they look and, well, which one do I use? Is it the configure desktop or is it not the configure desktop? And there probably was a discussion about this at one point. Also, I think the way that whoever packages the package that you actually use ends up, if they make a portion of that package designed to create an icon on the desktop, that they end up plunking their thing in some category here, and I can't think of any other categories, but say, let's just example, if LibreOffice decided that it wanted its like this is a little bit confusing. Let me get to this. So we have an Office category, then we have an Office word processor category. So why wouldn't there be a spreadsheet category? Or why would I have to go all the way over here to write an Office document versus this? And then why do my wine apps, especially, Microsoft Office, why doesn't it show up over here? Stuff like that. If there was any polish that KDE needed more, it was the menu. But even now with the new interface they have in KDE 4, I always choose to switch back. And they had a search box already. Now, I'm not trying to sell KDE, but I almost think I'm starting to do that. So if I had Word, there it is. So you still had a search, right? It doesn't need. But see, what I don't like about the whole Ubuntu thing is either you search for it and you might find it or you might not, depending whether you know the right name for the thing, or you're stuck scrolling down this gigantic xylophone of applications on the left, in which your app may or may not end up there otherwise, and then you have extra disk space you just can't use much, except for maybe a picture, which is almost true of this too. But I can move things around. Say I want my really quick stuff right here, or maybe if I have a habit of focusing on the center of the screen, maybe I want my icons there. The ability to move icons around are important. That's just my opinion. But it's not just the eye candy, and it's not just where it's a part of the that's just one part of usability. And some parts of usability are just kind of, complaints. Beggars can't be choosers is a good word to think for it. But it affects people's decision as to whether they're going to actually use this thing called Linux, or this thing called NetBSD, or this thing called FreeBSD, or this thing called IQ OS, or whatever your project is working on. Or whatever your project is. All these little things add up. So yes, the eye candy is important. Having choices of wallpapers is important. A good set of icons, that's all important. But at the end of the day, if someone really wants to use your system, they'll look past those things. But when it gets to the point where they simply cannot do something they need to do, they no longer have the option to look past the problem. And those are things I hope to address more so than just eye candy. And certainly, whether you have a search box or not having a search box doesn't fall under the category of being a make or break deal. That's something you could look past. Okay, it's got a search box. If I really want to use this, I could look past it. The problem is if you get too many of these things adding up, you're not going to make it. Now, or it just counts against you. Think of the way I see usability, or desirability. I should also throw that in too. Desirability / usability. If you can present your operating system in a way that presents the least amount of hurdles for people to cross, you'll have a higher success rate of people making it to the end of the line. So what you want to do is, at least with the things you can control, if you're in such a position, is to make sure that you put up as least many obstacles as you can, so there'll be no other reason but outside things that are happening to be why you're not emerging in the market. And there are some things that you can't do much about. Driver support, perhaps. Includes graphics cards, it includes cameras, it includes scanners, the like. So there's a whole myriad of categories that usability / desirability fall under. The ultimate goal, I would think, for any operating system would be able to be very flexible in the ability to offer the choice, but that all the choices will work very well. Which is different than what they say about what supposedly Unix philosophy is, and I, quite frankly, thinking about the Unix philosophy, don't really think it's a good idea to adhere to that biblically. And I'll get into that. The basic Unix philosophy is supposedly, well, it is, or it is said to be, but I'm going to criticize it. That's what I meant by the supposedly. Is that each program should be a tool that does one thing and does it well. And then you're supposed to be able to put all these little pieces together that do one thing and does it well, and put it all together, and you have your really nice customized system or formula or recipe. In fact, a lot of the time Linux solutions have been, there have been books that have come out that have Linux cookbook, things like that. Some of these solutions are really akin to being a recipe, to being able to just accomplish what you want to accomplish. But I think that's a real problem. Not the fact that there are recipes, but the fact that these recipes have not been automated and programmed, so because it's just a higher level of programming that the users are having to end up doing just to do something that they'd be able to do almost automatically in another operating system that your operating system is competing against. Whatever that is. So you actually want to figure out what a majority of users are going to want to do, put things in place that will allow them to do that easily, and be able to guarantee that the things you put in place to allow them to do those things easily will still work for a good number of years. A very good number of years. Oftentimes that probably involves some kind of guarantee about what the underlying environment is going to be. Now, the enterprise Linux products try to do this. They delay the release period, 2-3 years instead of every 6 months. Okay, which is fine. And they do try to say that there's a guarantee of application compatibility from one time to the next. The problem is of the number of Linux users that are actually out there, a very small slice of the pie are the people using these enterprise solutions, and they're very high priced in my opinion, too high priced in my opinion, to really justify paying it versus the proprietary alternative. And I'm just looking at this from a usability standpoint. I'm dropping all the political reasons. The political reasons do mean something to me. I support the ultimate cause and destination, but I don't think you have to sacrifice. I think until the Free Software Foundation is able to deliver the exact same usability product that a proprietary solution is able to produce, that it shouldn't go out of its way to stop proprietary solutions from working. And I'm going to use one usability example that became a big issue for some people. Okay. And people were really working on trying to find a solution for a very long time. It's just to be one example. So of course, I work in an office, and at one point I was trying to see how viable it would be, or doable, or whether it's even possible for an accounting firm or a CPA firm to simply have the choice that they want to use Linux as their operating system versus Windows or some variation of it. It's a complicated answer. Of course, if before there were computers, CPAs were able to survive, but as far as being able to use a computer and have it actually enhance your productivity to a reasonably close degree and extent that, hate to say it, Windows is able to do now, is possible under some very tight conditions, but that's a whole other subject. But anyway, but during that process, as I digress, of course, when we do our work, we store our files on a server. And so, like Word documents or whatever. And so a Linux desktop is going to need to be able to access the file server. Whether it's a Samba server or an NFS server or whatever. And I happen to use Samba here. So it's basically a Windows Server replacement. So the first usability issue, I'll discuss this now. Okay, so out of the box, as of this date, the Linux distributions are very good at one type of access to Windows style servers, and that is browsing the network and presenting what shares are actually available. So let me just show you how this basically works. Works the same way in KDE4. You just, in Conqueror or Dolphin or whatever the heck you're using, SMB, : and you have your 1 /. It'll scan the network, and fairly quickly, if your firewall has the NetBIOS and the TCP protocol ports open, in fact, if you're having trouble, the quickest way to actually be able to see your server is just to turn off your firewall, just so you know you can actually get to it. Then you can turn it back on. You can open up ports one at a time for security. But to start with, if you just want to see if it works quickly, you just turn your firewall off. But back to this. So here's the work group that we're in, and then just click on it. There are all the shares. I could even go into one of the shares, and it'll present, or one of the devices, one of the network names, and it'll present the shares, and I can go into the share, and it'll show all the stuff that's in there, and I could access everything. I could even edit it. So you think, well, what's wrong with that? Well, if you want to have a full integrated desktop solution, you actually have to mount your network shares. And I'm talking about a full desktop solution, or a desktop solution that in your specific use case. I will say this, I can't prove it's always going to be true, but I would say as a general rule of thumb, no matter what your use case is, especially in a work environment, you're probably going to have to use Wine somewhere there in the mix. And without it, you're probably not going to be able to do something you would have been able to do in Windows, as it is now. And that being the case, the inconvenience of using the alternative operating system doesn't outweigh the price is just too high, so you just don't use it. At least that's the way it's been in my situation. I mean, I'm not going to do a tax return by hand. Some of them get rather complicated when I could actually use a program to do this, right? Now that isn't a true thing. There are cloud solutions for tax prep. So, but that's just a blanket example I'm pulling out just to make my point. But nonetheless, so you can configure Wine to actually treat certain mount points as a drive. And so when you go to open up your, say, your Microsoft Word document, and you go to save it, you'll actually be able to save it to the same drive letter that you do in your other operating system, if that's what you're used to. Sometimes the Wine apps just won't start unless you actually have identified, unless you're trying, when you click on the item, it has to actually be located in a place that Wine thinks is actually a drive that's available to it. Otherwise it won't run. It won't actually really be able to tell where this thing is. Now the Wine configuration by default has gotten better. So I think it's actually almost set up to be able to deal with that in any location there is. But if you want to have a nice integration, in fact, I'll bring up one example that is absolutely essential. So there's a program called Lotus Organizer that is very old, that I've been able to keep alive for a very, very long time, which fortunately I've been recently experimenting with all my Wine installations, and so I have a broken situation at this point, which I will discuss as a usability issue. But nonetheless, this program, I had it so it start up as soon as you log in, and its Wine is configured, in this case actually Crossover Office, to treat a certain mount point as a certain hard drive or drive letter, which is on the network. And so when this thing starts, it's set to automatically open up the file that's on a particular hard drive letter that everybody has to share, so it's got to be on the network. So when I log into KDE, not only does my network share have to be mounted before this thing starts, but the Wine environment that this program runs in, this Lotus Organizer, it has to also believe that it can reach the file that everybody in the office shares. That's the calendar, basically. And if it can't, well, you just won't be able to reach the calendar. So you're out of luck. So that's one situation where it's absolutely essential that I am actually able in Wine to assign a drive letter to a mount point. Now this kind of solution does not suffice. Also, for usability, yes, I may be able to browse over to where the share that the file that stores the calendar is on, and click on it. And even if it is able to load it properly, it doesn't mean it's going to stay loaded. Or it's going to, a lot of the time when you run a file from here, and you click on it, it'll actually download the file from the Samba share onto, say, the temporary directory, and then once you save it, it'll load it back up. Well, if someone else is making a change to the calendar at the same time you're making a change to the calendar, your version of the calendar won't have their entry in it, and then when you copy your calendar back up and overwrite the existing calendar, their entry will disappear if you're doing it at the same time. Those are the kind of things you do not want to have happen, but can happen when you don't mount the share actually. So what's the problem? Well, you can't just, as you can in another proprietary operating system, I can't just right-click on this device here, or this actual share that's represented by a folder, and say mount, and assign a mount point to. That would be a very good, that would be an extraordinary, actually an extraordinarily good usability feature to add. And make it simple, and give the people their permissions, okay? And I'll talk about all that. So, and because it isn't there, the novice user is left to wonder, how does one end up mounting a network share? Because they may come to a point where they could even be a Linux program that's sharing a file on the network like this, and eventually they'll find out, especially if it's a calendar and it's not being run in an Apache web server or something like that, but it's actually file-based, which is actually much more user-friendly to set up for an administrator than if you just install something rather than having to configure PHP, Apache, and a whole mess of things, unless one little line in one config file isn't in the right place. You're pulling your hair out for an hour because it's much easier to actually know that all I got to do is install this binary and tell the binary to read that file over there, and I'm good. That circumstance doesn't always happen, and where it's not just having browsable Samba shares or Windows shares is not optimal for that situation because of what I've already said. Downloads the file, puts it in the temp folder, and then uploads it when you want to save it. But you're going to have things, it's not really going to sync up right unless there's some other mechanism to deal with that, but that just doesn't make any sense. What you should do is just give the user a way to mount these shares fairly easily. So we can browse to them, but we're not able to mount to them easily and graphically. Now you might say, well, Yast has it, or this tool has it, or that tool has it. It shouldn't be that complicated. And it shouldn't, because Windows will show us that. Windows shows us that. And I will say that FreeBSD has the same problem. FreeBSD is better at letting you know that there are network shares that are out there and available to you. You just open up one of these windows, and the available shares just pop up on the left-hand side. And I'm not quite sure Conqueror and Dolphin may do this, but that's not a complete solution. That's a half solution. So even for the OS X is what I was talking about, not FreeBSD. So for the OS X people, Apple, they're going to want to actually let the user mount the network share, because they're only letting the user treat the network share as a place to put backups. They're not letting the user use a network share as a place to store work files that is shared amongst a group of people. And that's a very big common feature that people paid a lot of money over the years to be able to do. And so why ship something like this? And just because you buy the enterprise product of Red Hat, enterprise desktop, doesn't mean you're going to be able to right click on the share and you're going to be able to mount it. The only thing you're buying with an enterprise product is the fact that they'll guarantee that the same programs will be able to run for a certain number of years, and there's some kind of certification, which I don't even know what it is. They probably made up themselves. That you get with that you don't get with regular desktop Linux. So there's more to the Samba story. Okay, so for the more adventuresome people, which includes me, eventually you're going to find out there's some kind of command you have to run at the command line to get your Samba share to mount. When I first started, it was like it is now. You have to use the mount command. But when I first started, you would mount the SMBFS file system. Well, now, when you try to mount the SMBFS file system, you get a message that says, SMBFS is depreciated. Or it may not even run at all. You may not even be able to mod probe it. But instead, your only choice will be to use CIFS. There's nothing wrong with CIFS, except if you're not familiar with CIFS, well, now you got to figure out how to use it. Well, you have two options. You have the forums, which are probably the best place to find answers or to cobble them together from different pieces here and there to fit your exact situation. And you have man pages, and man pages are horrible. As far as usability is concerned, no one should ever be chided for not reading a man page. So let's try this whole thing. Let's look at what the man page says. And let's look at what I actually had to do to mount one of these shares in the manner in which I wanted to do it. And then compare the two, and let's see whether the man page is actually usable. I think this is it, but we'll find out. Okay, yes, man mount CIFS. I can make this bigger. Okay. So what's clear is you're going to use the mount TCIFS. This is a little better. Having a username, a password, domain seems to be better than it was with SMBFS. But the one thing that's missing with man pages is context, and where exactly do these things go? Is there some specific order I have to put this stuff into? A user that does a little bit of research will know that they're probably going to have to use this thing called the mount command. They're probably going to have a -TCIFS in there somewhere. Somewhere they're going to have to put username equals their username, and somewhere they're going to have to put password equals and their password. And if there's a domain, domain equals and the domain. And they also know that they have to somehow describe this network share that they want to mount, and uniquely identify it amongst other computers that are floating about. And additionally, they're also going to have to pick where they want this thing to mount. And this is what the problem is with the Unix philosophy of doing one thing and doing it well, and not taking the time to put all this stuff together into something that people can use. So, and maintaining it and having it more or less universally available. And the problem is that unless the community in general knows exactly the order this is supposed, is there supposed to be a space here? Is there not supposed to? Is there a comma that goes here? Well, how does it go? If the general public doesn't know, people are just figuring it out. People will literally look at this, get some idea of what they have to do, and by trial and error, report their success back to some message board, which other people will pick up where they left off, and slowly but surely and eventually someone will emerge with the answer. That's a big waste of time for a lot of people. Now, I will say that there's one reason why there isn't really a graphical user interface front end that has survived the past 10 years. You know, it was somewhere around maybe 2009 or 8 or so. I'm not sure the exact year. It may have been a little later, but less. That CIFS, you had to use CIFS and you couldn't use SMB anymore. But imagine if you were the person that had taken the time to take the SMBFS command and automate it with a graphical user front end that everybody can download and everybody can use. And then 5 years later, you have to rewrite the whole thing because now people have to use CIFS. you may or may not want to do that, and depending how complicated it is. Now, graphical user front end, and I mean, I'm not a programmer. I mean, if you want to call bash shell scripting programming, you can, but I don't consider that programming. And I made a graphical user front end for the network client for Novell 411, which was in hindsight, their most popular network server. I just made a front end, and I made a script that put all the stuff together and delivered, a solution. And actually, I'll get into that story about usability. And then now I'm thinking about this. Well, what advice could I actually give? Well, I'm going to brainstorm. So you may or may not want to rewrite this graphical user front end. Someone else may or may not want to write it. Okay, fine. But if there was some way that the sifs command, when they depreciated and they say, okay, we're not using SMBFS anymore, why couldn't they make the sifs command work the same way the SMBFS worked? So that way, instead of typing mount minus T SMBFS, you would just type mount minus T CIFS and the same thing you did before, and you're done. Well, that would be very good. And if it's well documented, most everybody knows it doesn't matter if you add a little bit of usability by changing, the minus P option to password equals. Doesn't matter all that much. If everybody knows this, and if people knew that, okay, all I gotta do is make this quick and easy TCK, TCL graphical user front end, which was my point actually. That was the only graphical user front end I was able to actually get to work with bash scripting skills for NetWare. But so it's not that hard to make. If I was able to make it, it's not that hard to make. But if people knew that that might be the only thing you have to change in your code, they'd be more willing to maintain their graphical user front end. So you wouldn't need to worry about whether SMBFS minus P was too difficult to figure out versus SMBFS password equals is better. Especially when you still don't provide the context of where this goes in the whole order of things. Now it turns out what the man page doesn't tell you is you have to have commas in between user equals name of user, user equals James, comma, password equals password. You have to have commas between these variables. If you don't, it won't work. There was a thread over at the Ubuntu forum. It must have been 40, 50 pages long. People trying to figure out just how to use this sifs because someone decided SMBFS just wasn't going to work anymore. We're not putting that in there anymore. And everybody else, all the distributions, they all followed. And so it finally trickled down to userland. And then now people have to rework and work hard and experiment with trial and error to figure out how to do this. And then eventually someone will post it somewhere. Then it will get repeated over and over again. And finally, it'll just be part of what happens. Okay, so if the mechanism to mount a whatever kind of share changes, if it becomes whiffs, by golly, use the same options that are available in this sifs thing. If not, make a wrapper for it. If you're prohibited by copyright, then maybe someone else can make a wrapper that'll make it run just the same way that the other thing did. So that way, if someone makes a graphical user front end, it won't be broken in 4 years or 5 years. But the same thing is true for commercial games and commercial products. It's very unfortunate that even though Corel made a WordPerfect for Unix a long time ago, well, actually not that long ago, WordPerfect 8 for Linux and other Unixes, that you can't run that in Linux now. You might be able to run it in FreeBSD under an older version of Linux binary compatibility, but not in Linux. With a current distribution, slowly but surely the support started to wither away. And finally, when SUSE 12.2 or 3 came out, no one really had an answer as to how to get this thing to work. Gone. Good piece of software, no longer available. You paid for it. Now, it's true for other operating systems, but if that could be prevented, why not? You know, the WordPerfect for Linux had a pretty reasonably lengthy life. I will say that. However, let's see. Hold on a second. I'm going to fire up WordPerfect 6 for DOS in Linux, and then next thing I'm going to say is I can't get WordPerfect 6 for Unix to work anywhere. Not even 8, not even 10. That's unfortunate, right? In fact, I don't really need to show that, but okay, so one basic principle is flexibility. So if you have a lot of users that don't like graphical user interfaces, don't betray them. You know, don't set your installer to not allow them to have the type of installer they want to use. But instead, give the user the option. First question to ask when you do the install is, do I want a graphical user interface environment or do I not? The FreeBSD project's been able to manage this. I don't see why the NetBSD project couldn't do the same thing. I think Linux has it figured out. They're going to give you a graphical user interface environment. The second thing is don't dramatically change your interfaces and don't dramatically change the underbelly. Easier said than done, and sometimes this isn't in control. So it really has to be, if the larger body of people that use and make Linux can't cooperate enough to allow the end user to have a good experience, we're just wasting our time. We're making a toy. We're not making an operating system for people to use. Instead, we're making something to play with. Oh, that's kind of fun, but we don't take someone else's work seriously enough to allow other people to use it, because we're going to mess this little thing up and make their life difficult. And I think that happens a lot, unfortunately, and even though I do, for the most part, support the Free Software Foundation, I fault them at this. I say that especially with the incidents of Blu-ray burning. So just an example, you know, one major theme and one major problem with Linux with usability is that something's going to break every time you upgrade. It'll work for a while, but eventually it's going to see its turn. If it isn't the sifs command, it might be sound. It might be your scanner, or it might be your ability to burn Blu-ray discs. So I have this Blu-ray disc burner here, and as far as I know it, Linux has had the ability to burn Blu-ray discs since around 2007. There's actually been software available since around 2007 to burn Blu-ray discs. Okay. But there was some politics that got involved. For some reason, because the author had decided that he wanted to use a different license than the GNU General Public License, a group of people decided to fork the project for the sake of the license, but not for the sake of the technology and what is available to the end user. And if too many things go wrong for the end user, it's not just a simple matter of convenience. As Richard Stallman will put it sometimes it is just a matter of practical reality. No one is willing, most people are not willing to lose their job because they refuse to use Windows and they decide that they're going to do something by hand, like a tax return, all because Windows doesn't, because Linux doesn't have and that's a very extreme example, but on a minor example here, all I know, if I didn't look into the matter further, all I would know is that, I put my Blu-ray disc inside this Blu-ray burner and I tried to burn some files to it, and every time K3B came up, it would detect the disk, and then when I tried to burn it, it would tell me I couldn't do it, and so Linux sucks, and then I just walk away, and I'm not using, and then that happens, and then say I have some other problem with Wine, all of a sudden it doesn't work anymore, and then my wireless card doesn't work, and that's the truth. Right now the wireless card isn't working, even though I have one. And I say, why would I want to use this crippled operating system? I can't use all the apps that I need to do my job, and when I can, it doesn't work. Sometimes it works a little more clunky in Wine, and Wine doesn't really seem to have a long life. It suddenly just breaks. Well, why is that? So I don't, and then I got these two other apps I can't even run here, so forget it. Just bye. It's out of contention. You can't use it, or you have to change your entire. Okay, we're gonna make a decision. We're gonna put all of our tax returns in the cloud now. You have to make some really dramatic shift just to say, oh yes, I'm using Linux on my desktop. That has a cost too. So, is it worth it? If it's not, showstopper. And so every little thing matters. It adds up towards that total cost. It snowballs. So yeah, this may seem like not a big deal. Why don't you just go over here and download this thing, and this one's known to work, and okay, let's get into the whole story of this whole thing. So the same guy that made CD record and make ISOFS, very good tools. At some point, I don't know what year it was exactly. It's a few years before 2010, he decided, I don't want to use the GNU General Public License. I'm going to use the equivalent of the Mozilla license. Every desk, every major Linux distribution comes with Firefox installed. But because this guy decided to use the same license that the Firefox people use, pretty much, as from what I've read and understood. I haven't really studied it that deeply, but this is what I understand. The GNU project decided that they were going to take the project as it was before the license was changed and fork and keep it under the GPL. But they weren't able to ever properly add the CD burning license functionality, Blu-ray functionality, as far as I know. At least it doesn't work when I do it. And it's not a permissions issue. And I'll tell you why I know that that's not a permissions issue. So I went and did some research. And it turns out there's a very good group out there. I think the guy's name. His name's Thomas Schmidt. And he gets my kudos because he actually goes and looks for people They're having problems with their Blu-ray burning, and he goes and he talks to them. And he made a program called I don't know how to pronounce it. And he's not the only person, but he's been the most visible, so I'm giving him kudos for trying to find people. But he shouldn't be in this position in the first place. Usability would dictate he shouldn't have to go out there like he is. But I'll get to that. But I'm not faulting him. So, and this really isn't about faults. It's about, can we just stop and think and keep things going good for the end user? So my position is in this whole thing, and before I get into the rest of the story, is that until that Debian project was able to burn and do everything that the non-GNU project was able to do, they should not have put it in the distribution. It's that simple. Same thing with video drivers. If the Nouveau driver for an NVIDIA card does not work and produces a black screen for the end user, it should not be put in the distribution. They should use the drivers that are provided by NVIDIA. End of story. Why? That is a definite showstopper if all you have is a black screen. Most people can't operate very well with just a black screen unless they're experienced Unix users, and in that case they weren't going to care if they have video drivers or not. But that's a very small slice of the pie. But if you take out video, almost no one is going to try to endure that and figure out how to actually get their X drivers to work, and they'll think that Linux is a piece of shit. So all the good work that everybody else has done just gets thrown out the window and never gets a chance to be used or honored by people using software that was made out of people's kindness towards other people and goodwill towards their fellow man. And that is actually the indirect effect. You're actually depriving people of the freedom to simply use the software, which is more basic and fundamental than the freedom to modify the software. That's the basic principle. Another basic principle is think about what design changes you're making, like with KDE4. I'm sorry, but an icon, you can call a widget an icon a widget if you'd like, but I'd rather just call them icons and not have to lock them or or have this odd looking transparent box on my desk that moves around but I can't move the icons, or that if I change to desktop view and for someone else that uses Linux and they happen to accidentally change it back to folder view, or vice versa, I meant to say from desktop to folder, and they change it back to the default by accident, and they wonder why all their icons have moved around and everything looks different. That's a usability issue. There should be no reason why there was a desktop and an icon view. And I'm sorry, it's not a feature to have a little transparent box that has some icons in it and the rest of your desktop useless and unusable unless you go to folder view. It should just be frickin' folder view. And if you want to have fancy icons that are able to display stock tickers, just make an icon that could display the frickin' stock tickers, but don't cripple the desktop to accomplish that, which is what KDE4 has done. Now let's get back to the CD-ROM burning issue. But to back up, so if the users, when they try Linux, they only find that one desktop only presents a search box, and they don't know what the fuck these programs are called, and so they just don't, and they don't even know they have half the shit that they have because this thing on the side doesn't display everything, and then when they don't want to bother going up and down on it, and they don't know what the hell it is these icons represent anyway. Um, or the other alternative is a desktop that you can't put icons on it all that well, and you've got these weird things called widgets. You don't know what the fuck they do, and the icons don't look all that great, and they may stick with that, but there's, it's just like, it's just another reason not to use the thing. Or if they choose GNOME and the older GNOME, and they try to, they realize they have to dig through this giant tree of folders because they can't have their permissions automatically applied down the branches because it's broken. It's just another reason for people not to use the operating system. We want to give people reasons to use the operating system. And especially when a choice is made that hurts things, forget it. So anyway, this XORRISO works very well for Blu-ray burning. Kudos to the guy, it's great. If I didn't have that, in fact, that doesn't even come stock installed with SUSE Linux, and the only way I was able to get it is because someone had used their build service, so I was able to install it that way through a repo that was created through the build service. But if that didn't exist, and who knows if someone will do it for the next version, because you actually have to have some skill compiling programs to actually use the build service, then it just won't be available for SUSE. Meanwhile, it's the best one. But that's even a pain in the ass, and I love these guys. I think they're heroes. There's 3 people that have actually stuck with it, and they've even made a pledge that they're not going to change from the GPL. Okay. But the man page is incredibly long. It's just as non-understandable as any other man page. But at the end of the day, all you need to know is, all you have to do is type XORRISO as CD record if you want to burn your disk, and then type the commands that you would have used with CD record, except that you can't pipe that to make ISOFS because that doesn't work. Which used to be the trick to use with CD record and make ISOFS, so you wouldn't have to take up disk space to burn a disk. You just pipe the output from make ISOFS to CD record, and you wouldn't have to waste 50 or how many 25 gigabytes in the case of a Blu-ray disc just to burn the Blu-ray disc. Or have to have a minimum of 25 gigabytes available. That's big. That's a lot. And I tried piping it, and it wouldn't work. It seg-faulted. So it almost works like the other stuff, but not good enough. And it's slow. It's a lot slower than if I would have done it in Windows. It only goes at about 1 time, or Windows I can go 4 times. So, and if I'm burning 10, 20, 30 discs, it's going to take me 4 times as long. And a Blu-ray isn't a quick process, so it could, instead of taking 20 minutes for a Blu-ray disc to burn, it's now taking 1 hour and 20 minutes, and then that's a little bit long. About 3 times as long, I'd say. And if you have 20 of these, and it's going to take 2 extra hours times 20, that's a big fucking difference. That's a usability issue. Now, the guy is trying his best. I don't really fault him, and I think he's going to try to get there. And he probably will eventually. But at least he's trying, and he even tried to make it so people could use this program in somewhat of a familiar way, run it as this other program. But I just wish nothing would change. But because his command line is different than make ISOFS or CD record's command line, or DDs, or whatever, K3B and Brazero, that's for GNOME, they aren't able to tap into the fact that XORRISO is even installed and use it as the backend instead of CD record or make ISOFS. Specifically, the version that is the GNU version and not the good version. So, well, okay, say I don't want to use XORRISO. I have to go uninstall make ISOFS. I have to uninstall CD record. I have to uninstall XORRISO. Then I gotta hope I haven't broke anything. Then I gotta hope for one or two things, that I found the good version of make ISOFS and CD record from the SUSE build service, which I thought I did, but apparently I didn't in this case. Or if I really want to be sure I got the right one, I got to download the source code and compile it myself. And you know that never works. You need this library, you need this library. Then you get some error on line 55, it just doesn't work all that well. Used to work better when I first started. Now it's like I don't hold my breath when I download a package to compile. I don't. I just think that I'm probably not going to be able to use this package. Maybe if I'm like in the old days when everybody was downloading compiling sources, they would eventually catch the bugs in the configure and the make programs, the make files. Another usability issue. So why should I have to, it ended up that I ended up spending an additional 8 hours just to come to the conclusion that my best choice was to use XORRISO, and that it was probably going to be 2 to 3 times as longer to do that than just to use my Windows machine. It shouldn't be that way. It should be that there should be some kind of basic checklist that every distribution goes through before they release their stuff. It doesn't require some kind of fancy certification that is going to justify a $700 a seat license, but it should be a check that, yes, your Blu-rays, we guarantee your Blu-rays will burn. We guarantee your CDs will burn. We guarantee that these cameras will work. And they're actually tested. So people actually know this. So the way the Debian project does their, quality control testing can be divided up just like the Debian project divides up their software packaging. So a distribution, say like SUSE, can have, okay, you're the camera guy. And so your job is, when we have the release candidate for OpenSUSE 13.2, sometime before the release, it's your job to plug in your Logitech QuickCam, whatever it is, into this USB, make a recording, and tell us whether it works. And if it doesn't, tell us why you think it doesn't work, or what the problem was, or whether we'll try to fix it before we actually do the release. Why not? Why couldn't, some other guy could be the Blu-ray guy? That would do a lot for usability. Also, adding just the little things that would make a whole lot of difference and make it easier. A quick way to mount network shares. Someone making a graphical user front end. Some kind of pledge or some kind of guarantee from the people that deal with CIFs or mount or whatever, or just a general guideline for whoever is going to make such a thing, that it's going to work in a certain way so graphical user interfaces won't break over time. With those kind of things in place, the user base will know what they can count on over time. X has really gotten good recently, I will say that. And then once that people know that once they learn how to do something, they're never going to see it break. It's always going to work for a really good, long, reasonable amount of time. The Linux base will grow. It will probably grow to at least the size of what Apple has in market share. I don't see why it wouldn't. There are only a few applications that are commercial apps that are made for the Mac. And guess what? With this kind of stable environment for vendors to operate in, if they know that if they make something today, it's going to still work in 2 years, they will take the time to compile their app for Linux. You know, I mean, compiling something, at least, I don't know, I'm not an expert at commercial software by any means. I know little about it, but I do know a little about compiling, and I know that whether I'm in FreeBSD or whether I'm in Linux, I still type make install clean if I want to download a package and compile it. So I don't see why it would be that big of a leap to run a third compile script for the Linux version of, say, QuickBooks or, you know, Adobe, whatever, all the things that people are really wishing Linux had and saying that they don't have and are leaving in frustration. Or TurboTax, you know, I mean, a lot of FreeBSD is a lot more viable for CPA desktop work than Linux is because Linux has not kept any of its commercial apps, and it has become a real pain. I had an experience with a wireless card that worked perfectly in OpenSUSE 12.1 with the native driver. Didn't have to do a damn thing. 12.2, I had to use NDIS wrapper, but at least it worked. 13.1 didn't work in either case. That kind of thing just shouldn't happen. Once a driver is in kernel space, it should stay in kernel space. Really. With NetWare, the real sad story about that is, okay, by the time I came on the scene, NetWare 4.1.1 was sunsetting and considered to be old technology, just about. And NetWare 5 was getting old, and NetWare 6 was the hot new item. Now, NetWare, when it went from 4.1.1 to 5, it abandoned the IPX protocol, and it used TCP/IP. It basically uses Samba at that point. I don't know if it used the exact Samba product, but you know they're not going to sell Novell anymore. They're just selling SUSE Linux Enterprise with Samba. And that's it. There isn't a Novell product. They're just selling the boxes that are left over, as far as I could tell. If there are any. So Samba beat out Novell, but why did that happen? Well, for one, it was cheaper to make Samba and all that stuff. But let's get back to the client. So my first experience with Linux, it must have been around 2000, 2001. And I just wanted to answer the simple question. Could our accounting firm, if we wanted to, be able to choose, you know what, I think we want to use Linux to do our work in. Okay. Could we have that simple choice? And so I went and I was down at the computer store and I was buying Windows 2000 at the time, and I looked and I saw a box of Red Hat, and I think it was 7.3, something like that. And it said, and I knew what IPX was. It says supports IPX. Okay, I'll grab that thing. I don't know, maybe this might be viable. Let me check it out. It's got a cool guy with a red hat. When I did the install, I was like, "What the hell is this crazy shit?" It was my first reaction. I mean, what are these packets? What is this lib this? I didn't understand libraries. I didn't understand much of anything. If anything, Linux is a very good learning tool. But then when I tried to actually use IPX to log into the network server, which is, as far as I know, the only way IPX is used, when you followed the instructions, it simply didn't work. I didn't know this. I thought I just didn't understand the man page, and I may not have. What finally made it work for Novell 4.1.1 but not 5 was if you installed a network server emulator in your desktop, it would allow you to see another network server, and then you'd be able to mount it. But if you didn't have Mars NWE installed, no matter what you did, you weren't going to be able to mount it. Well, what happened? Well, SCO as we know it now used to be called Caldera. And Caldera was really close and friendly to Novell at one point. When Novell, after they had bought Unix from AT&T, they sold it to the Santa Cruz operation, which renamed themselves Caldera, and they were Linux friendly at the time. And Novell subcontracted with Caldera to make a NetWare client for Linux. And they made one. But it was for kernel 2.2. And I actually have some floppy disk images of this thing. So after my frustration with Red Hat, I looked around to see if there was any Linux distribution that claimed to have a NetWare client for Linux. And I looked for those words. I didn't trust... From that point on, I didn't trust if some Linux distribution claimed that they had IPX support, that I was actually going to be able to log into the network server. And yes, I do know about NCPFS. I know about the whole formula. Okay. I went to Caldera's website, and they said they had a network client. So I ordered it. But when I got the package, it didn't have a network client. And the reason is because the network client that they had created only worked with 2.2 kernels. And the only product I was able to buy was for 2.4 kernels. And somewhere in kernel land, some decision was made to just poo-poo on all the drivers. So they had to be written, and guess what? Caldera decided they didn't want to rewrite their frickin' driver. So that was it. Basically, no one really had a network client until finally, at least for Novell 4.1.1, until almost the sunset of Novell 4.1.1's life. Or if you decided to stick with a 5 or 6 year old distribution, or if they used my NetWare, which wasn't really mine, it was just me putting together IPX, NCPFS, IPX utils, and Mars NWE, downloading them, putting them all in the right places, and presenting a little TCL TK GUI that was able to actually show a proposed mount point that included the name of the network server. So the user actually knew that it was able to find their network server. The product's still there. It's called NetWare, but it doesn't... I don't think anybody's going to use it now. I don't know if anybody really has a NetWare 4.1.1 server out there anywhere. But it did very well. When I made it, all I know how to do is shell script, but if I changed anything, I did a complete reinstall of my system, and I reinstalled it. And if anything went wrong, I did it again. I did it again, and I did it again. And so at the end of the day, the only complaint I really had was that I put the binary in a non-traditional place for Unix purposes. Or maybe the shell script, actually. I don't know about binary. And that was it. A lot of people were able to actually use that, and I was proud to do it. But if Novell servers were still popular and used in IPX, and the same IPX and NCPFS and all that stuff were required for it to work, I would have been pissed off several times during the life of this thing. I would have asked myself, why... I would really have become annoyed when SUSE decided to change over to Yum. Then I would have become annoyed again when SUSE decided to change over to zip. Um, when apt-get was working just fine in SUSE, when that project went away, things like that, I would lose my incentive to keep going. So I don't know why distributions decide to change perfectly good working package managers wholesale. I don't know that I could say that just because they use zip instead of apt, that SUSE is now able to provide really smooth running upgrades from the command line. Zip or dupe, that's all you got to do. If you're root, after changing the repositories, I don't know if the result will be any different had they stopped using apt and if they just stuck with apt, they'd probably be in the same position they are now. I don't know why they changed it, but that would have given me a reason not to continue to maintain something that perhaps a lot of people might have wanted to use. Would someone have forked it? Maybe, maybe not. No one forked the code. I don't know how to hack kernel code, so trust me, if I would have known how to hack kernel code, I would have updated that Caldera driver. They sent the source code to me. I just didn't know what to do with it. No one maintained it after that. That was it. That was the death of it. NKFS was the driver. That was it. It was done by 2.4, end of life. And that's really sad. I shouldn't have had to have done that whole thing. I shouldn't have had to struggle for over a year looking for answers. I shouldn't have had to have the guts to try out some guy's recipe that he had posted at the Novell fans board just to see if it would work. I was lucky that it did. I was lucky he had made that post. This guy named Victor Baldassi. But that's it. So when it comes to usability, one, keep the infrastructure usable. Don't try to oversimplify. Two, give people features that they want, not just features that look like they're cool and can do the same things, but at the end of the day go poof on you, such as mounting a network share. Three, don't put broken stuff in a distribution in the name of a license when you're putting other stuff with the same license in your distribution. And four, keep the under space intact. And no matter what project you are, unless you want to strangle your own user base to non-existence, give new users the option to use a graphical user interface during their install. Simple. It doesn't have to be fancy. The BSD installer uses TKL, so what? But if at the end of the day I could choose to install KDE3 and there's another place where I could say I want a graphical login, that's all I need. And so I don't see how that harms anybody to have those options available. And quite frankly, it's, can't figure that much out. You don't have much of a chance. You're disrespecting your own project when you don't make it available for everybody. And if your open source project disrespects or damages other open source projects, you're actually disrespecting those other projects, and you're disrespecting their goodwill, the collective goodwill from all the people that's worked on this system. You're disrespecting that collective goodwill towards the general public. Okay, I guess I'll stop for now. If I think there's more things, I'll go ahead and go over it.